Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Colonel Jacques Baud, a former member of the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service. So it's good to have you back on the program, sir.
Nice to be back with you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you today was about the situation with Israel. It appears that this can't go on forever. It seems to be exhausting everything from most of its resources, not just weapons, money, its reputation, both among allies and adversaries, human resources as people are exiting, and overall, the decline of the United States also suggests that the whole international system or world order, which it operated in and was allowed to go down this path, is also eroding. I was wondering your thoughts to what extent the Israel represents a case of strategic overreach.
I think it's interesting because today we have two major conflicts going on. I mean, obviously, Israel, as you mentioned it, with the Palestinians, but also Ukraine. And in both cases, we have a lot of similarities. Um, we see that in both cases, we have a government, namely the Israeli one and the Ukrainian ones, who are in fact exhausted to some extent, and there's an increasing feeling that in both cases the government is waging kind of a private war. I mean, it's obvious in Israel because of the specific condition and the legal procedures that may happen on Netanyahu once he leaves the power. It's different, obviously, in Ukraine, but probably not so different because we feel that in Ukraine there is a strong effort from the government to stay in place and to avoid any situation where the government should would be obliged to quit. And and probably also because of procedures, and we had all this issue of Nabu Sapo in the recent days. But in Israel, this is obviously the case that we have here a private war waged by Netanyahu. And if we add to this people like Benjamin Smotrich, Bezalel Smotrich, sorry, and Ben Gvir, who in fact, to some extent, wage also kind of a private ideological. So it's not because of legal constraint, but because of ideological issue. They wage an ideological war. Um, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they are very keen in having the whole of the Palestinian territory under Israeli control. And therefore, there is absolutely no sign. And since Netanyahu cannot rule without those two, especially their party, therefore, we don't see any appeasement in this conflict. On the contrary, it seems that they go, as you just explained, from bad to worse because they are exhausting everything, including patience of the Israelis themselves, including lives of Palestinians, obviously, but also of the military. There's even an increasing discontent within the IDF. We see also that the traditional allies of Israel, namely Western Europe and obviously the US, have more and more interrogation and questions about the purpose of the conflict, and not just the purpose, but the way it is waged. Again, we are here. I think we're fine. In fact, Israel is somehow uh, revealing what it is because um, as I have explained on other channels, Israel is a country that since its very inception, even before it started to exist in 1947, it never abode by law. And that's absolutely fascinating. It is a country that never abode by law. They had their own rules, and they pledged to have kind of a special status, and that's something which is, in my view, unique in the modern world, especially when we consider that Israel is considered, and was considered, better said, as an advanced position, a strong point of the Western society and the Western civilization in the Middle East, and the only democracy of the Middle East, and things like this. But in fact, it's a country that never applied international law, and that goes as far as 1940. So even before it existed, in fact, and that's very interesting. The problem is that because of World War II, we I mean the Western societies and Western countries never dared to oblige or constrain Israel to abide by international law. There was an attempt for that in 1949, as Israel wanted to enter the United Nations. It was requested or required from the United Nations, the Security Council, asked Israel to make a public pledge that, as a condition to be member of the United Nations, it should pledge to follow the international law. I think no other country was obliged to do so, but Israel was obliged to do so. That was in May 1949, as a condition to stay in the United Nations. And that's very interesting. There were a lot of interesting legal discussion about this, because obviously since then there are more than 150 UN resolutions that condemn Israel, that said that Israel is not abiding by international law and abiding by UN resolution. And a lot of people have said, well, in fact, if we come back to the declaration of Israel in 1949, we should expel Israel from the United Nations. So there is an interesting case here that has developed, and there are interesting discussion if you go and check on the international law website and things like this. Very interesting debates on that. But in essence, Israel is a country that has behaved like a rogue state. And what we have witnessed in the last year and a half or so, in fact, is probably the tip of the iceberg, because we have never seen such a brutality and such an acknowledgement of brutality, because we have seen in many cases, and the West, namely in fighting in Iraq or in other places, Vietnam then, and other places, they were neither they weren't so sweet either. I mean, they were quite brutal, and we had a lot of bombardment of civilian population and all that. But here in Israel, the strange thing is that it's in fact somehow acknowledged by the government. Is even explained as a strategy, to fight terrorism, obviously, and in despite the various efforts from some country of the international community, namely South Africa, with the complaint they carried at the International Court of Justice, where obviously there was some indication that we are witnessing a possible or plausible genocide. This has not refrained Israel from using again and again the same method, the same way of waging war against not just against Hamas, but against the whole Palestinian population. So there is, I think it's a very fascinating case here in legal terms, but also in political and moral, ethical terms. As a former military, I would say I'm ashamed by the thing that by the fact that Israeli officers and soldiers call themselves officers and soldiers, because for me it's mere terrorism, it's nothing else. They express like a joy in killing children and things like this. And we had, not just now, by the way, we had about 10 years ago and even more, we had testimonies of soldiers saying they were killing or firing on children in Gaza just for fun, just for fun. And there was a famous case that happened, I think it was in 2009, where a group of children playing on the beach in Gaza were just killed by Israeli soldiers. And they say, well, we didn't know what to do, so for fun we just killed them. And that's something that we have never seen that in history. I think not even during World War II we have seen that in concentration camps, people killing for fun. It was methodic. It was, I mean, you can qualify everything the way you want what the Germans did, but it didn't appear that they were fun in killing people. Here it is, and that's something which is quite unique and makes this conflict unique. And the way the government respond to international critique make it unique as well. And that goes beyond what we see in Gaza, because when we have the recent 12 days war with Iran and this attack of Israel against Iran, knowing that's fascinating. Knowing that the U.S. intelligence community had stated that there were no nuclear weapons in Iran. So meaning that there is no rational, factual justification for starting a war, attacking civilians, bombing civilians, and things like this. And I think it's quite unique in history.
I think the some of this is changing though. Some of the immunity, as you said, Israel is it seems to operate under its own unique rules, given that it's considered to be this living in a dangerous neighborhood, as the Americans always say, but it's seen as being part of Western civilization. It is able to project military power into a strategic region. And as you mentioned, the World War II, the crimes committed against Jews there and the Holocaust, added to giving some extra leeway, I guess. Uh, but the conditions it's allowed to operate under is quite unique. No other countries are allowed to develop nuclear weapons and have no accountability. Simply skirt to the whole non-proliferation treaty, the occupation of territory, the apartheid policies, the seemingly endless non-stop wars. But as we come to this genocide, though, it must be, well, not must be, it is definitely the most well-documented genocide in history. We can every morning watch the new videos of children being massacred, refugee camps being bombed, uh, again, the children all being shot, waiting for food. And this is complemented by statements coming from their leadership, where they very openly state the intent that they can't have the Palestinians there more. And you see a wide sentiment among the public as well. So it does appear that they have taken it too far. And I guess under the topic of Israel exhausting itself, I think the goodwill is also coming to an end. And there's something interesting is happening as well. That is, even among the Israeli population, there's now discussions in the Israeli media to what extent Israel is doing what the Nazis are doing. This is was a big no-no in the past. That is, you wouldn't compare Israel with Nazis. It's been done, but it usually comes with ramifications. But now in the American political system, you see, especially on the political right, which was quite unique, people opposing the endless support for Israel. And you see now Western governments in Europe as well, also feeling pressured. I'm not sure how genuine you see this. You probably seen the press conference with Starmer from the United Kingdom, where he now suddenly expresses great concern for the starvation and killing of Palestinians. Again, a bit late for this empathy, and I guess I'm a bit cynical in terms of how genuine he is. But do you see a massive shift here, both among what this Israeli public is willing to put up with, but also what Western governments, even if they quietly wants to support Israel, its limits now, I guess, what the public will permit.
Absolutely. And if we look at it, I would look, if I answer your question from a geopolitical point of view, during the whole Cold War, the Israel was considered, as I said before, like an advanced position of the West in the Middle East. And we have to remember that at the very beginning, and that's very interesting to go back to history, because at the end of World War II, the whole Mediterranean was under the control of the Allies, in fact, the French and the British. I mean, the Western Mediterranean was mostly French, and the Eastern Mediterranean mostly British. And the Soviets wanted an access to the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore they pledged support to those Jewish resistance movement against the British, um, with the hope that once Israel would become an independent state, this would be a kind of a Soviet strong point around the Mediterranean. And it didn't turn exactly as Stalin wanted. In fact, as soon as the Israelis got their independence in May 1948, despite the fact that they had been supported with weapons and money for their independence war, the Israelis turned toward the West. And that creates some reaction in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union started then to trying to take control of other countries in the Mediterranean. And you had kind of a shift in the 50s. Uh, the Arab states became more and more related or associated, or yes, to the Soviets, and the West lost a lot of its colonies. Therefore, you had the case of Algeria, you had the case of Egypt, you had all these cases where the West was expelled, and Israel became then the very the strong point of the West in a Middle East that was quite largely under Soviet influence. And therefore, that explains why the West, for so long, accepted all the deviation, of the Israeli state. And and remember that during the Cold War, Palestinian movements, Yasser Arafat and others, were essentially Marxist movement, in fact, and that reinforced the support that the West had for Israel. But since the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the communist bloc in Eastern Europe, things have changed. And we have seen a lot of countries, including Syria, by the way, who tried to have better ties with the West. The West refused to some extent, and that led to the situation we know today in Syria. But there was this attempt from Arab countries to get closer to the West. And today, these countries who used to be just suppliers of oil and raw material, today they have developed their own industry. They have obviously evolved in two industrial states. The case of Iran is an example, a case in point. And we have today a Middle East which is quite intellectually and economically closer to the West than Israel is. And you may remember that a few weeks ago you had Donald Trump visiting Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia making a pledge for 600 billion or even more, like $1 trillion investment in the US and so on. Meaning that the significance of Israel in the regional context of Middle East has changed and radically changed, because today the rest of the Middle East, I mean the non-Israel part of the Middle East, is in fact a kind of they could be considered as part, they could be, because I'm not sure the policies that we have in the West have understood the move that was going on. But in any case, we have a Middle East which is in demand for having better relations with the West, which is rich enough to supply the West, to buy products, to engage into partnerships, to engage into economic and industrial cooperation and things like this. While Israel is in fact a state that lives only not, it doesn't provide much to the West, it receives from the West. So we have here this I would say structural change that we have in the Middle East that today appears very clearly, because with the kind of embargo or blockade that is waged by the Houthis in the Red Sea, we have seen that now the port of Eilat in Israel is basically bankrupt and non-functional. Other ports, and that was demonstrated during the Iranian the 12 days war with Iran, that other ports like Haifa and so on are extremely vulnerable, and that Israel is in fact extremely dependent on the West, is not a partner that can provide something to the West. It is just a partner that receives from the West, and what it gives in return are simply problems. You see? So on the other hand, we have other countries in the Middle East who, in fact, seems closer to solution providers. So Israel is today a problem maker, a troublemaker, while the rest of the Middle East has turned to be solution maker and problem solvers. So the situation completely reversed, and that is a part of the explanation of this change in perception. And obviously, as you rightly pointed out, all this goes together with what we can see every day, those massacres, those brutal behavior, misbehavior from soldiers, and all that. And that, of course, impacts quite significantly on the public opinion. And in the West, we have the problem that and that's not just related to the Palestinian conflict, by the way, but what we have seen in relation to the Ukrainian conflict, especially, is the broadening gap between the ruling elites or the leadership that we have both in countries like UK, France, and so on, but also between with the elites of the European Union, for instance, and the population. And that's what we have in Germany, like now the AfD, which is progressing so quickly that now the government thinks about banning the party and things like this. So we see that this um, broadening gap between the public opinion, I mean, the population and the elites, has also played a role because for a while, this elite, and probably that was also part of the gap that is broadening, as I said, because for, as you said, it's very late that these leaders in Europe realize the magnitude of the catastrophe that is going on in Palestine. But because in the early stage, I mean, last year and even early this year, nobody even questioned the tactics and the methods and the weapons used by Israel. And today they realize that there is probably an effect of the popular pressure. That's probably one aspect. But also they realize that more and more the support provided to Israel becomes politically and I would say legally untenable because we see that everything they do basically is I mean they do the Israelis the Israeli government does is without any excuse because even if you admit that the Hamas would be a terrorist organization, you don't destroy a population just for the sake of reaching a few combatants. And by the way, the various reports we had from various organizations include the IDF itself, by the way, that despite all the killings, the massacres, the destruction of infrastructure, of population, of medical infrastructure, of food infrastructure, and all that, despite all that, they were not able to reduce significantly the combating or fighting power or fighting capabilities of the Hamas, meaning that is something fundamentally wrong in the strategy which is used, and therefore there is probably a growing sense in Europe, and including, I mean, if I talk to my military colleagues, former military from the NATO, because despite the fact I'm Swiss, I used to work for 5 years in NATO. And of course, I had my peers and I had contact with them. And when I talk to them, and they're all senior officers, I mean, colonels and so from the of NATO countries. I mean, I don't know a single one who is in favor or supporting Israel. I think everybody realized that this is not the way you solve the problem. Even if you admit that Hamas is a terrorist organization, which in my view has not been demonstrated, by the way. I have written several books on terrorism, especially Islamic terrorism, and I've written the book which is behind me here on the Al-Aqsa flood operation, which is the 7th of October 2023. But before that, I wrote several books on asymmetric warfare in the Middle East, and I studied the case of Hamas very extensively. And even if we admit that the Hamas used to start as a terrorist organization, probably in the late 80s, early 90s, I would say that since the early 2000s, You don't see, and they said they will abandon the terrorist strategy, and there is no slightest indication that they didn't apply this policy of not behaving like terrorist organization. The Hamas in the early 2000s pledged to be a political organization, and that's what they have done. That's why they won the local elections in 2002, and then the regional elections in 2005, which gave them the power in Gaza, especially because the US didn't want to accept the result of the election and therefore tried to topple the Hamas-led government, or yes, the Hamas-led authorities, and that led to these clashes with the Fatah at the time. And that was almost 1 year clashes between the two organizations. But if we look with the honest eye on the behavior of the Hamas, I I I really defy and challenge anyone to tell me what makes the Hamas a terrorist organization. Certainly started that way. That in the at the end or during the second Intifada certainly did so. But then it has changed its policy. It has understood, as it did Yasser Arafat in 1974, when he realized that terrorism was in fact um, playing against the Palestinian movement at large, because it affected the perception of the worldwide opinion towards the Palestinians, and it was better to abandon terrorism. And the PLO in 1974 officially abandoned terrorism. There were still some factions that continued to rely on terrorism, but PLO by and large refused that. And Hamas did exactly the same process during the early 90s up to the early 2000s. So even if we assume, if we accept the Israeli narrative that Hamas is a terrorist organization today, the way they try to solve the problem is something that will, in any case, that will never solve the terrorist problem. So if you really wanted to solve a terrorist problem, then you would adopt, and in my books I suggest I've written a specific book on fighting against jihadi terrorism, and I suggest strategies to deal with that kind of terrorism, which is very specific. It's not the same kind of terrorism we used to have in Europe in the 70s, 80s or so. It's very different. Even if the word terrorism is widely used, it reflects a very different um, substance, and you have asymmetric terrorism as you have symmetric terrorism. Although in the West we tend to use the word asymmetric for defining terrorism, whatever it is, but in fact you have also symmetric terrorism. So therefore, to address terrorism, you need to have a much refined perception of what you are fighting against and what kind of strategy you want. But what we see in Israel is definitely not a strategy that is designed to defeat terrorism. I think the Israelis, on the contrary, have a strategy that I would say, in fact, provoke terrorism. If you want terrorism, you do exactly what the Israelis do. If you wanted to suppress terrorism, then you would deal with the problem completely differently. And this is, again, nothing really new there, because all these thoughts and strategies have been also studied in the early 50s, late 40s by the British, especially when they had to deal with terrorism and guerrilla in the Southeast Asia and all that. And they had a lot of thoughts in dealing with terrorism, but we have forgotten those lessons. And we tend to reply to what we call terrorism, which is, by the way, today it is a word that doesn't reflect something very specific. When you don't like somebody, just say he's a terrorist. And today, when you have people demonstrating in UK, for instance, they demonstrate for Palestine, or they use the emblem of a watermelon, and using the emblem of watermelon qualifies them as a supporter of terrorism. So meaning that the word has no longer any meaning, and therefore you cannot have a strategy to fight against it, and therefore everything you do, you brutal force is accepted. And that's also the reason why for so long the West has in fact tolerated or accepted the misbehavior of the Israeli government towards the Palestinians.
It does appear that the language have been constructed for a narrative control. That is, any expression of understanding for the position of the Palestinians would then be equated to terrorism, Hamas support, anti-Semitism. So there's always this ability to shame in order to
Exactly.
crush dissent or make dissent illegitimate by presenting it as, well, delegitimizing the dissent. Not that different from any of our other wars, one could add, because you see the same, I guess, in
This is
the
exactly the same.
Ukraine.
My uncle used to be in a French resistance, despite the fact I'm Swiss. I had a French uncle. He used to be in French resistance. He was considered as terrorist by the Germans.
There you go. Well, Well, in terms of the sustainability of all of this, do you see any economic problems brewing in Israel? Because especially in the war with Iran now, they took some heavy punishment in terms of destruction of infrastructure, energy infrastructure. We see with the conflict with Yemen intercepting some ships, they're having some economic losses with their ports, and the overall sense of insecurity as this the sense of control and dominance in the region slips. More Israelis are fleeing the country as well, which is, and if I'm not mistaken, especially the young people, which is problematic because they work in many of the high-tech sectors, which really drives the economy. Is this a bump in the road, or do you think this is a wider or deeper problem which will be difficult to resolve?
I think it's a deeper problem. And again, you have a variety. I mean, Israel is a very complex country, and I mean, sociologically speaking, and you have a multi-layered type of problems because obviously, as you said, you had the direct effect of wars and strikes from Houthis, Iran, and all that, and we mentioned the port of Eilat that is bankrupt today because no ship is allowed to reach that port. But there are other factors. One factor which is quite strong today is the fact that because the IDF has problem to recruit people, that they want to change the law and also oblige, because in the I mean, there is no constitution in Israel, but there is a set of basic laws that rule it's a corpus of laws that constitute some kind of constitution of Israel. And there are laws in the basic laws of Israel that, in fact, prevent or forbid to have the Jewish fundamentalists included in the armed forces. They should be exempted from recruitment, and basically what you have in the IDF are people who are not part of these very fundamentalist part of the country. And now, because they need soldiers, they have the same problem as in Ukraine. Again, we have back to the government won't like to change the law, and that creates a lot of problem. And in turn, this has led a lot of people outside uh, um, of Israel to say, well, Israel is no longer a Jewish state because it doesn't even abide by Jewish, it doesn't even respect the Jews themselves. So and that led to and not only that, there are other factors, and obviously what we see on the news plays a role in that. But you have also a kind of a disinvestment of several companies who refuse now to operate in Israel or to have any contact with Israel or exchange with Israel. They refuse to fund companies in Israel and all that. So you have the direct effect of war, but you have an indirect effect, which is the investment effect. And that, in fact, is extremely heavy on the the, um, the not just the Israeli economy, but also the society. If you add to this that today a lot of people, I mean, normally you have a lot of tourism. I mean, you have uh, obviously you have cities like Jerusalem and all that, who attract a lot of tourists every year. But apparently now people don't want to go to Israel anymore. Including Jews, refuse to go to Israel anymore, not simply because of the security situation, but because of the moral and political stance of the country. And so and that's also new because obviously you always had security concerns related to Israel. As we said, terrorism is not something new. Um, Today, it's no longer terrorism as such, or probably less. It's probably the risk of rockets and missiles or things like this. I mean, a lot of people have been taken by surprise during the Iran this 12-day war. So you may find yourself in the same situation, especially if Netanyahu. I mean, a lot of people consider that Netanyahu will strike Iran again, meaning that Iran will strike back again, and therefore it's not the best condition to take vacations in Israel, even if you are Jew, by the way. So if you add all this, you see that some people have tried to make kind of a count to quantify the loss of Israel. It's of billions every month. Billions. I don't know exactly what how these figures are reliable or not, but the whole crisis will certainly be a major financial economic crisis for Israel in the long run, and probably longer than this, because a lot of people, as you rightly said, who have left Israel, and I have seen testimonies from people coming back from Israel to France, for instance, and they have said, we are not going back to Israel. We're not going back to Israel. This is done. We wanted, it was an experience. A lot of people left Europe in 2012, 2014, as you had this wave of terrorist activities in the West, related to the Islamic State. Again, this is always the same thing. We create problem in Iraq, we create problem in Libya, we create problem in Syria and all that. We make life impossible in those countries, and those countries, they return us the favor, and therefore we have terrorist activities in our country and all that. Anyway, um, after in this period, in the about 10 years ago, a lot of Jews left, especially France, because France is the largest Jewish country in Europe, if I can put it that way, as it is the largest Muslim country in Europe, by the way. So a lot of Jews left to make their aliyah to Israel. They take the opportunity, in fact, because they said, well, we don't feel safe in France. But now they are coming back because they see that the situation is worse in Israel. So we have a situation that may durably, for the long term, a disaster for Israel. And this is the consequence of the inactivity of the Western polity. Had the Western leadership understood what is at stake and that Israel has everything to lose by misbehaving, by disregarding the international law and all that, should the West had prevented that and helped Israel to solve the problem differently, probably Israel would not be in that situation. So it's ironical to see that because we nobody wanted or nobody dared to take influence in the conflict or try to prevent the massacre of population, that's exactly the reason, or the reason why today Israel is despised by everybody and has become kind of a rogue state. And I think here we have we have a similar situation as with the Ukraine. I always said, when you are as a party of the conflict, if you are Palestinian, if you are Israeli, if you are Ukrainian or Russian, then you behave like a Ukrainian, like a Russian, and all that. And I completely understand that. I know people in Ukraine, I know people in Russia, and I perfectly understand their stance towards the conflict, because they feel that they have a relation with the nation, with the country, and all that. So I understand that. The problem is that when we are an outsider, like specifically as a Swiss, but that applies to any European, when we are outsiders, that we have the privilege not to be involved in the conflict, and we don't use this opportunity to help not one of the actors, but to help both of the actors by providing kind of mediation a service, by providing advice, and to try to help both parties to avoid being, let's say, emotional or taking emotional decision, and start to be factual. And I think the European leadership, both at country level and at European Union level, failed to do so. We cannot expect that from the US, because the US has obviously vested interest in all these conflicts. They started those conflicts. Therefore, we cannot expect them to be a perfect mediator also. But Europe would have been, or European countries, regardless of which country. I obviously have Switzerland in mind, but um, because we have no reason to be involved in a conflict, why didn't we take the opportunity to advise those countries, those parties, from the very beginning? And I mean, not just talking about Israel and Palestine, not just on the from the 7th of October 2023, but before the 7th. I explain in my book here that the crisis started well before, and all the signs, all the indicators of a major situation, major crisis, were already available in the spring of 2023. And in fact, I started to write the book before the 7th of October 2023, because I had the indicate. I mean, I felt that it would, at a certain point, it would explode. Meaning that if I had this feeling, why didn't European countries have a similar feeling and tried to take influence over the different actors in order to prevent the explosion that we had from the 7th of October? Nobody did that. And I think here it's a major failure of the intelligence, strategic intelligence in the West. And remember, this is my this is my professional background. Here, I think strategic intelligence has failed, definitely failed in all European countries, all. And you also have the failure of the European leadership or the European polity at large to understand what was at stake and to have the courage to come both. I mean, we could have exactly the same narrative for Ukraine, by the way, but in that case for Palestine, how come nobody had the courage to come before what happened on the 7th of October 2023 in order to see and to make Netanyahu or the government aware that something was boiling and was ready to explode? And some mediation would have prevented that. Again, I to me, it's obviously the failure of the Israeli government, definitely so, but it's also the failure of the Western governments who didn't make the slightest effort to prevent that, to find solutions. And now the problem has raised so high, then you have the water here and you have to react. And that's exactly what we have seen with Keir Starmer. Exactly that.
I think it's fascinating how, yeah, these wars, both the Israeli wars as well as the war in Ukraine, how they are now eating away at the West as well, militarily, economically, but also the political legitimacy. Because, as you said, instead of positioning themselves as security providers or someone who would seek to resolve the conflicts by getting so deeply involved in what were effectively losing wars and also wars of aggression. It's quite a horrible, horrible mistake which has been done. But yeah, my last question though was about just Netanyahu. How stable do you think he is now? How stable is his position? And also, where does the pressure comes from? Is it the political opposition? Is it the public, the military, or the intelligence services? Is any of the current policies strengthening his hand, or I say undermining his own position?
Well, again, I'm not aware of all the details and all the whereabouts of what's happening in the backstage of everything we see, and obviously a lot of is happening, and you have a lot of people trying to get some influence in all that. You have all this issue, as I said, of the fundamentalists, the Haredi group in Israel, and those people like Ben Gvir, Smotrich, who are definitely strongly related to the settlers in the West Bank, especially. And in addition to that, you have obviously this injunction by the International Criminal Court, not the International Criminal Court, sorry, the International Court of Justice, that Israeli have absolutely no right to be in West Bank, and therefore they should, in fact, leave the area. This is a Palestinian territory, and they have nothing to do there. And the International Court of Justice, and there is also a UN resolution on that, that says that every country should help Israel to fulfill its obligation. So there is a lot of aspect that plays there, and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are strongly tied to the settlers, because they come out, they were settlers before. I think Ben-Gvir was from settler origin. So that means that these guys are um, they, they they are more and more into uh, um, in German you have the word Sackgasse. It's how would you say that? It's a it's a street without end. You know. Oh, I don't have the name right now in mind. In any case, so that means they are trapped in some cases, and therefore uh, I I I see that in such situation you may have extreme reactions, and there were some rumors recently that Netanyahu had been poisoned. I don't think it was the case, but probably it's a kind of rumor we may have again, and I think Netanyahu is very concerned about his own safety or security, because we might have a situation, and we have a similar situation in Ukraine, by the way, that the government is in such a situation that there's no way out, basically, and therefore we might well have something happening, but I don't think they have strengthened their position. They have strengthened the legal framework. They have strengthened the security framework. All that has been strengthened to some extent, and the laws and all that. And we have exactly the same in Ukraine, by the way. But the situation of the government in itself is not strengthened, and the reason for strengthening security laws and law enforcement and all that is precisely because the government is in a very precarious situation. So I think again, I don't have any crystal ball here, and I can't predict the future, but I would suggest that there might be some change in Israel, and that will be a radical. I mean, it has to be a radical change. I don't know if it will be, but it has to be a radical change, because otherwise, Israel, and I think some people predicted, and I have the feeling that, I mean, again, I'm not predicting, but I'm warning more than predicting that Israel may cease to exist because the conditions for maintaining that stability is no longer here. You have a growing pressure coming from the neighboring countries to have policy changes in Israel. Not political change, but policy changes. But that may evolve into political changes, including probably some forceful action. I don't know. I hope not. But again, and you have also the pressure from the West that is also increasing on the government. So something has to change, and therefore. My view is that Netanyahu is trying to preserve his position because he tries to avoid to be confronted to the court for his the accusation of corruption and whatever. And I don't know if he will succeed on that, but certainly that what he's doing is not in favor of Israel, and Israel will suffer from his own ambition and his own, let's say, willingness not to accept the legal consequences of what he did. So we are definitely in a situation where Israel is closing in towards a crossing, a very important turning point in its existence. And if it missed the point, it may well disappear. I mean, that's something because we have also a lot of things are not coming into the media in the West, but you have a lot of trouble regarding the Mount of Temple, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and so on. And this, in fact, and when we talk about the operation of the Hamas that I have behind me, it's the Al-Aqsa flood. Al-Aqsa, because in fact, a lot of troubles that started before October 2023 were in fact related to what's happening on the Mount of Temple. And this has completely been forgotten by Western media. But this is exactly the kind of thing that may trigger an intervention from other Muslim countries. Because even the Mount of Temple is, as you know, a holy place, both, I mean, for Christians, for Muslims, and for the Jews. And any change to the existing situation might trigger definitely. It's a second holy place or the second or third holy place for the Islam. So the Muslim will not tolerate any change of that. And there is a serious threat because, as you know, fundamentalist Jews want to build the third Temple of Solomon there, and that means to destroy the mosque which is on the Mount of the. Therefore, you have a lot of issues that are related, and a lot of issues that are not even mentioned in our media that makes the picture of the conflict extremely complex. And even, if we have a situation, for instance, in Jerusalem, the Mount of Temple, that may trigger an Arab intervention. Probably not the Palestinian situation, but the Mount of Temple. But nobody talks about it. Therefore, we have also a kind of a distorted understanding of the conflict. But that plays a central role for countries such as Saudi Arabia and probably even countries such as Syria. I mean, remember that Ahmed al-Shara used to be a fundamentalist. So for him, certainly the second or third holy place of Islam has some kind of importance. Therefore, you might have a kind of holy alliance of all the neighbors of Israel in the case you have some changes of the Mount of Temple. But this is something which is totally ignored by the West. And so there's a lot of unknown factors that may come into the game here. And that's why I say we have to be very, very careful. And when some say that Israel might disappear, it's probably not totally unfounded. I'm not saying it's sure, I'm not saying it will happen and all that, but I think this should be a serious concern because there are so many aspects. As I said before, the problem, Israel has multi-layered problems. And we tend to speak just about the Palestinians, but in fact, there are many others that are not addressed and certainly not addressed in the West when we talk about the situation there. And all this may play an important role in the future and for the future of Israel.
Yeah, this is the the strange rhetoric I feel coming out of Israel. That is, all these events which are described as great threats are also presented as great opportunities, as if they're standing on the border now of all or nothing. So, of course, and this applies to everything. That is the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the destruction of Gaza, the idea of knocking out Iran as the head of the snake, the threat but also opportunity of balkanizing Syria, using Jolani and his henchmen in Syria to go after Hezbollah, having this territorial annexation, of course, in Syria to be able to create a new pathway up north. Um, it's just, it's very Yeah, it does appear that this is the moment for Israel to either take advantage of what it sees as in a chaotic situation, or indeed be consumed by it as well. I think this is whenever you have a strategic situation where, well, it's everything or nothing, you will usually see the actors being willing to take huge, immense risks and gamble everything. It does appear this is where Israel is at this moment, because there is no going back at the moment either. That's what I think they realized with Iran, why there has to be a second war there, because the relationships they have across the world now is being spoiled uh, domestically. Also, the situation has been shook up. If people are coming back, they have to kind of resolve, or at least make the pieces fall in a good place after the whole board has been thrown up the air. So, no, it's a very dangerous situation when this is how Israel probably sees it. That is, now is the time to go for full victory, or essentially, yeah, knowing that they can also go under.
This is absolutely true. And we have a very similar situation in Ukraine. We see exactly the same situation where uh, the government doesn't see any exit point, and therefore might be tempted to escalate the situation. And this is exactly the situation we have in Israel. And it's very interesting, the similarities, because the leadership in Israel, in fact, comes from the region of Ukraine. You see, they have the same culture. They have the same religion, by the way, but also same culture. They come from the same region. Poland, Western Ukraine, and all that. So, meaning that we have very similar situation with people who are, let's say, driven by vengeance, revenge, who are not keen in negotiating. And this is not just now. This has been demonstrated well before the crisis we have right now. But we have seen that in the past. They are not willing to negotiate, or if they negotiate, they are ready to abandon what they have signed for other reasons. So this is exactly the same behavior you have on both countries, and this is this sense that when you don't see a solution, a practical solution, a negotiated solution, then in fact you don't even look for a negotiated solution. You have to go to uh, uh, shift gear and go to escalate. And that leads to situation that may be extremely dangerous for both conflict. And the interesting thing is that for both factors, for both conflict, the main actor, or let's say the actor that could play a significant and probably the most constructive role, if I can say that way, would be the United States. The problem is that we don't have in the United States a leadership that, in my view, understands what is at stakes in both areas. And in the US tend to oversimplify the problems, to tend to find solution in so-called deals, which are in fact imposed to a party, not even negotiated. We have exactly the situation in Ukraine as we have with the Hamas. They try to impose a situation, which in fact leads to nothing, because nobody wants to abide by a deal which has been imposed. It has to be negotiated in good faith. And the current administration in the U.S. tends to make deals. I mean, it reminds me the Godfather, the movie. They make proposal you can't refuse. This is that. This is mafia-like deals. So, and that's exactly what we had with the European Union just days ago. It's exactly that. I increase the tariffs, and you don't want that. Okay, we negotiate. I reduce the tariffs, and in addition, you give me that. So this is simply mafia-like deals. And that's exactly how the current administration deals with crisis in they tried to solve the crisis in Palestine, in Iran, and in Ukraine, and it failed in all the three cases. And the Iranians have said no. I mean, you cannot impose us. We are ready to negotiate. We are ready to discuss, but we don't want an imposed deal. And we have exactly the same thing with the Hamas, and we have exactly the same thing with the Russians. And that's why Trump is disappointed by Vladimir Putin. But it's clear, he comes with the idea that he's the strongest. There is nothing better than the United States, nothing bigger, nothing stronger, nothing most effective than the US. Therefore, why would the other refuse a deal? The problem is that in none of this conflict, none of them, neither in Palestine nor in Iran nor in Ukraine, US has a leverage against the Palestinians, the Iranians, and the Russians. Has no leverage. Therefore, now all these areas, and that is the expression of this context that has changed, and I mentioned that before. This change in conflict make that today the West has no longer the leverage it used to have for this region, and that it could use in order to impose a solution. Today, it's no longer the case. It cannot impose it. And the problem is that the West has not understood that. They have not understood that they are no longer the ones who can decide for the others. And if they want to solve a problem, they have to talk to it, but not just talking by unilaterally, to have a dialogue. Dialogue, you have the word die, that means two. A dialogue is with two people. And So, and the dialogue means that basically both sides should, at the end of the day, find their interests in the deal, not just one. And that's exactly the problem we have with the current administration. This is a key factor because, as we see, and it's interesting to see that in all the three conflict, the three crises, nobody even tries to find a solution through the European diplomacy. There's not even an attempt to involve the European diplomacy. As you talk about a negotiation, try to find a solution, everybody looks at the US. It's fascinating for all the three countries. I mean, for Iran, it's a little bit different because it has more a bilateral dimension, because obviously there was a bilateral issue between the US and Iran. Therefore, it's obvious that the US might be, let's say, an actor in this dialogue. But when it comes to Palestine, there is no fundamental reason for having the US. You might well have other actors, European actors, Asian actors, Middle Eastern actors, and the same in Ukraine. Basically, there is no specific reason, although here also the US has a specific issue with Russia. Yes, with Russia, and even Marco Rubio said that the conflict was a proxy war, basically between the US and Russia. Therefore, that makes the involvement of the US more or less natural. But even though we might have other actors in the game, but it's not the case. I mean, Europe is definitely absent from every diplomatic initiative. There is not a single action that has been decided by the European Union, or even more, no single action acted, done by by the European Union. So it's tragic. And again, everybody relies on the US. So the US might be the key for everything, but the administration is not in an intellectual position, in a political position to solve the problem. In fact, they are in most cases part of the problem.
I think that's one of the challenges of our time, that is to rediscover diplomacy. I think this is something we lost after the Cold War in the hegemonic era. Again, why multilateralism doesn't tend to thrive when there's only one center of power. You do end up with situations where one side dictates. And I think this mentality is one of the real challenges as we're readjusting back to a multipolar world when the US and its allies can't impose its diktats anymore. Anyways, Colonel, thank you so much for your time. I think I already went a bit over time, so thank you so
Problem.
much. I appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.